Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've given us a really fascinating stack of material, all focused on this core idea, how language isn't just, for talking. It actually shapes how we understand the world. We've dug through it all, and it's really clear language isn't just a channel for information. It's a fundamental tool for building knowledge, and maybe even for challenging it.
That's absolutely right. Your sources really drive home that language is never just a neutral pipe. It actively structures how we perceive things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we're going to look at 6 key areas that really jumped out from the materials you sent. The power of metaphors, what happens when we bend or break language rules,
Okay.
how our own values creep into representation, the sheer impact of classification systems, how language messes with our emotions, and the tricky business of names and labels.
And these aren't just like academic points, are they? They have real effects. Science, tech, politics, everyday stuff.
Exactly. Real-world consequences.
So the mission here for this deep dive is basically to give you, the listener, a sharper sense of how language is working away under the surface. It's not just about what we say, but how that shapes how we think and, what we actually do.
Well put.
Okay, let's dive in. Metaphors first. The sources show they're way more than just colorful descriptions.
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating here, and it comes through in your sources, is how metaphors don't just describe, they actively shape our understanding. They actually sort of point us towards certain questions and away from others.
Give us an example.
Well, think about Flatten the Curve, early days of COVID-19.
Oh yeah, vividly.
Your sources show how that simple image, that visual of a curve, it took this abstract concept, exponential growth, which is hard to wrap your head around,
Totally.
and turned it into a really clear public health goal, something people could grasp, could act on, and that, in turn, helped justify things like lockdowns.
Yeah, it was powerful. You could almost see the curve being pushed down.
Yeah.
So visual.
Exactly. But then you have something like, data is the new oil.
Right, that one's everywhere.
And it gets really interesting because what does that comparison emphasize?
Extraction, right.
Yeah.
And like market value, money.
Precisely. And if you think about the bigger picture, that oil frame can really drive investment towards data mining, maybe overlooking other ways to think about data.
Like what?
Well, what about data privacy or data sustainability? Thinking ecologically, maybe? The oil metaphor doesn't naturally lead you there.
Good point. And in AI, you mentioned neural network. Sounds very biological.
And the sources suggest that wasn't accidental. Early AI folks borrowed that brain language. It helped get funding, helped the public see machine learning as sort of brain-like.
Even though it's really different under the hood.
Very different. It's math, it's models learning from data, not really biological neurons firing. But the metaphor shapes our expectations, maybe our fears too.
Okay. And in science, CRISPR as molecular scissors.
Yeah, another vivid one. The sources link it to text editing, cutting and pasting DNA.
Makes it sound almost simple, like fixing a typo.
Kind of, and that framing definitely influences the ethical debates, makes it seem less like a potentially huge biological intervention and more like, just an edit.
And the old classic greenhouse effect.
Right. Goes way back, 19th century physics, according to your sources. That image of a glass house trapping heat, it frames the whole climate issue. Influences talk about emissions trading, like closing the vents, or even wilder geoengineering ideas, like putting up planetary blinds.
Some newer ones are popping up too. Heat dome from summer 2024. That really stuck.
It did. It painted such a clear picture, especially on weather maps, right? This literal lid trapping the heat.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, your sources note, is how mayors in places like Phoenix use that metaphor. They talked about opening the dome with their preparedness plans, and it helped them argue for federal funding. Real policy impact.
Wow. And then the UN Secretary General switching to global boiling in 2023. That felt like a deliberate escalation.
Definitely. And it spread like wildfire on TikTok, apparently. Got into EU climate risk laws. It's a much more alarming, visceral image than just warming.
Even in public health, the CDC's vaccine wall of immunity sounds solid, protective.
And a study in 2023 you mentioned in your sources found it actually helped people understand booster timing better than technical stuff like antibody titers. You can picture building a wall dose by dose.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, the sources rightly point out that a wall sounds static, fixed. But immunity is dynamic, it changes, it wanes. So the metaphor simplifies things, maybe too much.
Okay, so the big takeaway on metaphors.
Yeah.
super useful for understanding complex stuff, but they always highlight some things and hide others.
Exactly. And that directs where science looks, what policies get considered. It's powerful stuff.
Right. So let's switch gears. What about challenging language? Breaking the rules. Your sources talk about how innovation often comes from bending or breaking conventions.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Think about all the new words bubbling up on social media.
Oh, yeah. Yeet, simp, or the other one, goblin mode.
Goblin mode, right. These
Hmm.
things just appear in online groups, get used, and suddenly, boom, some even end up in the Oxford English Dictionary.
Seriously.
Yeah, it shows how these peer networks can kind of sidestep the traditional language police. Usage drives meaning now almost in real time.
And Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem, that wasn't exactly standard stuff.
Not at all. She blended rap cadences, sign language, really stretched what a national poem could be. A deliberate break from convention that opened things up.
I also thought the hashtag hijacking example was clever. K-pop fans flooding hashtag White Lives Matter.
A really smart way to use language, or maybe the platform of language, to subvert hate. Drown out the original message with totally unrelated stuff. It's like digital counterspeech.
And then you have the ongoing thing with inclusive pronouns, singular they or ilel in French. That clearly rubs up against old rules.
It absolutely does. These pronouns challenge the deep-seated binary gender assumptions in language. And you see the pushback, right? Legal fights in France and Spain about using them officially. Institutions don't always like their grammar rules questioned.
Even something seemingly playful, like using emojis for variable names in code on GitHub.
Yeah, it seems fun, maybe creative, but it raises real questions. Is that code readable? Is it accessible to everyone? So even bending the rules there has practical side effects.
That French Senate bill vetoing gender-inclusive language in official documents, that's serious pushback, saying it's unintelligible.
It is, but then contrast that with the Spanish neutral pronoun el. It's not official, not in the dictionary, but your sources say it's thriving in universities in comic book translation.
And so like bottom-up change.
Exactly. New norms being created organically despite the lack of official blessing.
And Oxford picking brain rot as word of the year for 2024 feels very online-driven.
Totally. Came up fast on Discord, Twitch, then got recognized. It's just maybe the power dynamic is shifting, It's not just academics deciding what counts as language anymore.
So basically, language rules aren't set in stone. They're more like social agreements.
And always up for renegotiation when people need new ways to say things.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about values? How do our underlying beliefs shape how we represent the world? Your sources say representation is never neutral.
Never. And maps are such a great example. The Mercator projection we all saw in school.
Yeah, Greenland looks huge.
Exactly. Makes Europe and North America look way bigger than they are compared to, say, Africa or South America. It reflects a certain historical Eurocentric viewpoint.
Whereas other maps like Gall-Peters or Orthograph,
They try to show equal area, correct that size bias. It's a different set of values embedded in the map. Maybe prioritizing fairness in representation over preserving familiar shapes for navigation.
even choosing words carefully, like The Guardian switching from climate change to climate crisis back in 2019.
That small shift signals urgency, doesn't it? Frames it as an immediate danger, not just a gradual process. And that choice can definitely sway public opinion over time.
The military using euphemisms.
Mm-hmm.
That's always a bit chilling. Kinetic option instead of bombing. Collateral damage.
Mm-hmm. Those phrases are designed to soften the reality, to reframe the moral side of things. Using less direct, less emotional language makes horrific things sound almost bureaucratic.
And AI image generators showing bias early on.
Oh.
DALL-E 2 making most professional people look like Western men.
Yeah, that was a stark reminder that AI learns from the data we feed it, biases and all. It wasn't trying to be biased, but it reflected the patterns in its training images. Our societal values baked right into the code.
Political maps, too, the cardograms. Showing election results by land area versus population tells completely different stories.
And completely, one map makes rural areas look dominant, the other shows where the population centers are. Same election, vastly different visual narrative influencing how you interpret the results.
The recent AI issues with race seem to show it's still a struggle. Google's Gemini pausing portraits because it overcorrected.
Right. It started making historical figures inaccurate in its attempt to be diverse. Shows how tricky it is to get the balance right. You try to fix one bias, you might accidentally introduce another problem.
And Meta's tool apparently refusing prompts for an Asian man with a white partner. That's specific.
It is. It suggests biases baked into the safety filters, maybe reflecting assumptions about what's normal or acceptable. These systems aren't neutral observers.
The Brookings audit, finding AI image tools swing between stereotypes and reverse bias, sums it up, maybe.
I think so. It highlights that whoever builds the model encodes a worldview, consciously or not. There's always a perspective embedded in the output.
So the main point is our values guide not just what we show, but the actual language and visuals we use.
And that shapes how everyone else understands it. Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk classification. Putting things in boxes. Your sources show how changing those systems can have massive effects.
Huge effects. Take the DSM-5, that's the big manual for mental health diagnoses.
Right.
When it shifted from Asperger's syndrome to autism spectrum disorder in 2013.
What happened then?
Well, it broadened the criteria. More people fit under the autism umbrella. That changed funding for services, research focus, and even how people in neurodiversity movements saw their own identities. Big ripple effect from changing one category.
And the Pluto demotion in 2006?
Yeah.
People got weirdly emotional about that.
They did. Redefining planet meant rewriting textbooks everywhere. It was a great public reminder that even scientific categories aren't fixed forever. They change as we learn more.
The WHO, using Greek letters Alpha, Delta, Omicron for COVID variants, seemed very practical.
It was. Replacing geographic names like the UK variant or South African variant helped reduce stigma, made it easier to share data internationally without pointing fingers. A deliberate classification change for social good.
Even on Amazon, how sellers label things to show up in different categories.
Yeah, that's a clever example. They strategically tweak product titles to hit multiple classification boxes. It shows how the platform's algorithm for sorting things actually shapes seller behavior and maybe even product design.
And the WHO recognizing gaming disorder in its disease classification, the ICD-11, in 2022.
That had real consequences. Influenced whether health insurance would cover treatment, changed how parents talked about gaming. Giving it an official label made it real in a new way.
The new EU AI Act, classifying AI by risk level. That sounds like a big one.
Oh, it's huge. Creating tiers, unacceptable risk, high risk, etc. means things like recruiter chatbots now need audits, like medical devices. That definitely affects where venture capital flows in the AI world. It's a whole new regulatory taxonomy.
What about the idea of a Category 6 hurricane for storms stronger than current Cat 5s?
Even though the U.S. National Hurricane Center hasn't adopted it, just proposing that category in a study shifted how the media framed Cyclone Ilsa. It made it sound even more extreme. Shows how even potential changes to categories can change perception.
And the WHO's fungal priority pathogens list from 2023.
Perfect example of classification driving resources. Labeling Candida auris as critical basically unlocked research funding. Other fungi labeled medium priority. Less attention, less money. The label directed the focus.
So, yeah, the lens you use the classification system really determines the patterns you see and where the money flows.
Fundamentally. Okay, next up. Language and emotion. How words are used to persuade, influence, maybe even manipulate feelings. Your sources hit this hard.
Cambridge Analytica, using those fear-based Facebook ads in 2016 comes to mind immediately.
Right. Micro-targeting voters with messages like, they will take your jobs. Pure algorithmic rhetoric designed specifically to tap into anxiety and sway votes, using emotion weaponized by data.
Brexit's Take Back Control slogan felt similar. Simple, emotional.
Incredibly effective. It boiled down hugely complex legal and trade issues into one gut-level appeal for sovereignty, much stickier than dense factual counter-arguments.
The anti-vax term plandemic, that played on emotion too, didn't it?
Definitely. Mashing up plan and pandemic instantly suggests conspiracy, triggers suspicion. And the fact it rhymed made it catchy, memorable, harder for fact-checkers to fight. They had to debunk the rhyme and the claim.
On a totally different vibe, Nike's Just Do It. Pure emotion.
Absolutely. Short, imperative, evokes determination, works across languages. And remember the sales boost after the Colin Kaepernick campaign in 2018? Despite backlash, aligning with that strong emotional message paid off.
Even in science, describing a drug as a game changer in a press release.
That taps into hope, excitement, but it can inflate investor expectations way too early, maybe even bias peer reviewers before all the data is in. The emotional framing can get ahead of the science.
Forever Chemicals for PFAS, that label itself sounds ominous.
It does. Activists and regulators used it deliberately to emphasize persistence, evoke dread, create urgency. And it worked. The EPA even adopted the nickname in its official 2024 plans. Shows advocacy language becoming institutionalized.
Rishi Sunak Stop the Boat slogan in the UK in 2023. Very stark, very visual.
condensed a really complex asylum policy debate into a powerful, almost militaristic image, made nuanced discussion much harder.
And quiet quitting. That phrase went everywhere.
Yeah, and your sources point out it actually repackaged existing HR data about employees being not engaged. But the catchy, emotionally resonant label took off, prompting companies to suddenly invest in well-being software. The label created the buzz.
So hitting the emotions just makes persuasion easier, lowers the threshold.
It's classic rhetoric, really. Engage the feelings, and the mind often follows. A very old technique, supercharged by modern media.
Okay, last big area. Names and labels. You said they're shortcuts, but potentially pitfalls, too.
Exactly. They help us categorize quickly, but they can lock in meaning, sometimes misleadingly.
Like the difference between global warming and climate change.
Yeah, surveys suggest warming might evoke more personal risk for some people, but maybe both terms downplay the sheer volatility and unpredictability that something like climate emergency captures better now. The label frames the risk.
Defund the police. That slogan was, well, controversial.
Very. It was a shorthand for a whole spectrum of ideas, from budget tweaks to abolition. But opponents could easily grab the literal meaning and use it to shut down conversation about any kind of police reform. The label became a weapon.
But sometimes a label can be powerful in a good way, like long COVID.
Absolutely. Coined by patients on Twitter, that label gave a name to a poorly understood set of symptoms. It helped people find each other, build communities, and crucially, it galvanized research funding for conditions that were often dismissed before. It legitimized the experience.
The hoverboard example is kind of funny, but makes the point.
Totally. Calling it a hoverboard when it didn't hover led to lawsuits. Consumer expectations set by the name weren't met. Accuracy matters.
And CRISPR babies, after the hijacks news broke.
That shorthand obscured a really critical difference, editing reproductive cells, germline, versus body cells, somatic. Very different ethical stakes. The simple label made nuanced regulatory talk harder.
Ozempic babies,
Yeah.
the recent term for unplanned pregnancies on those weight loss drugs.
Another social media coinage. It definitely flags a potential issue for doctors, which is good. But it also risks oversimplifying complex drug safety data, maybe causing needless panic. It's a double-edged sword, that label.
The Cheat GPS and Science Act in the U.S. That acronym sounds friendly.
Right. Clever branding. Framed massive industrial subsidies as being about cool tech progress. Helped get bipartisan support for big government spending. The name softened the policy.
And NGOs using moonshot for extreme heat adaptation funding.
Yeah, borrowing the positive buzz and ambition of the JFK space program. It's an attempt to make things like better drainage systems sound exciting enough to attract big philanthropic money, leveraging the emotional power of a famous label.
So labels matter a lot. Get it right, and you accelerate understanding. Get it wrong.
And you can bake in misconceptions, hinder progress, or spark unnecessary conflict. Choosing wisely is key.
Wow. Okay, so bringing this all together, what's the main message from this deep dive?
I think fundamentally it's that language is so much more than just communication. As your sources show again and again, it's how we build our reality, how we construct and contest knowledge.
Right, through metaphors.
Through breaking rules.
How values shape representation.
The impact of how we classify things.
How language pulls our emotional strings.
And the power and pitfalls of the names we choose. It's all interconnected.
So hopefully, as you, the listener, go about your day, you'll maybe have this heightened awareness. You'll notice the language being used around you and the language you use yourself and see that hidden power.
Yeah, see how it's shaping perceptions, policies, even what scientists decide to study.
And maybe be a bit more critical, a bit more mindful.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to chew on. Now that you've done this deep dive with us, think about your own world, your job, your hobbies, your daily life. Are there common terms, common phrases you use or hear all the time that maybe deserve a closer look? What assumptions might be lurking inside them?
And could reframing them, thinking about them differently, maybe open up completely new ways of seeing things, new insights or perspectives. Something to think about.